Okay, today we're going to be learning Masechet Yoma Daf Yudalid. Today is International Women's Talmud Day, which is a great initiative that was started a number of years ago to increase the knowledge and awareness that Gemara is open to women, for women, etc. So welcome and thank you for joining us. If you're joining us specifically for International Women's Talmud Day today, excited to see you here. You're welcome to join us anytime. We meet daily, same time, same link. All classes are recorded. You can find them at hadran.org.il. If you want more International Women's Talmud Day events, you can look on our site on today's daf post. There's a link to it. Also, I think on our header at the top of the page, you'll be able to just link to it and find it. Or if not, then on the daf post. Okay, so with that, we're going to get started. I did some research on a bunch of different things. So I'm going to kind of start off with a bunch of random issues of relating to things that we've learned in the last few days. Shabbat sometimes gives you the opportunity to have more time to read up about different things. One of the books I used was Safrai's book called Mishnat Eretz Yisrael, which I've made reference to before a few times. And another was my husband Shiur in Shul. He was talking about the Big Day Kuhuna because it came up in the Parsha this week about the clothing that the Kohen Gadol wore. And so I'm going to say a few things about a few of those. First of all, let's start with the Big Day Kohen Gadol. Something he quoted from the Meshech Chachma, which I actually tried to find this morning. I couldn't find it, but apparently he talks about this difference. There's two reasons why the Kohen Gadol wears different clothes on Yom Kippur. One is because it comes up in the Gemara later. One is so that he not a Baal Gava, right? You wear those fancy clothes, you feel like you're someone very important. He's supposed to be like a simple Kohen. The second is Ein Kategor Na'aseh Sanegor, which is he can't go in with the regular clothes that have gold on it because the gold was used in the Cheda Egel, and he can't go into the Kodesh Kodeshim with, kind of in your face, oh, look, here's the gold, and we use gold for the golden calf. So he asks about why there's two different reasons. And he says that if it all depends on that machloket that we saw about the avneit. Was the avneit, remember it was clear that the Kohen Gadol has an avneit, the belt, that's this colorful belt made with shatnez, right? The wool and the linen. And the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippur wears one that's just linen, and that was clear in the Torah. In fact, if you noticed in the Parsha, it comes up in the beginning of the section about what clothes he wears, and it also closes the section, which I thought was very interesting. So the idea is he goes in with this linen belt. Now, the question is, what does the Kohen Hedyot wear on a regular day? Now, if you remember, the Kohen Gadol wears the 4 regular garments that the Kohen Hedyot wears. Now, if the Kohen Hedyot is wearing the same belt as the Kohen Gadol on regular days, that means that when the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur walks in with these clothes, he doesn't wear the same clothes, that he doesn't look exactly the same as a Kohen Hedyot. So if you use this answer of Baal Gava, that he shouldn't become so arrogant because he should look like a simple Kohen Hedyot, if he has a different belt than the Kohen Hedyot, then he already stands out and he does look different. And that's why maybe you need the answer of Ein Kategor Na'aseh Sanegor. And it sort of depends on this machloket about whether he looks identical. And this is what I wanted you to envision. When he goes in, is he going in looking dressed exactly like a regular everyday Kohen? Or is he like an everyday Kohen, but with this one change of the belt, which, as you know, accessories make a big difference. So then he does look different because he's not wearing what everybody wears every day. I know you think, how noticeable, but of course it's noticeable, especially if you're in the temple and everybody wears the same thing every day. You notice if somebody's wearing a different belt because they'd stand out, right? It's kind of like this, reading this book about the army and how the idea of the uniformity and how that created the environment, how when they built up the Israeli army, one of the things they tried to do was to say, you have to wear, in the beginning, people were wearing different things, and no, you have to wear the same clothes because that's how we create the environment here. And then that's how clear whoever is different stands out because their clothes are a little bit different, right? Depending on their ranks or whatever it might be. So using that as our model, you can see how the Kohen Gadol, it would be very different whether he looks the same as the Kohen Hedyot or doesn't. And that's why that sugya was a very central sugya. Okay, a few other things. Yesterday's daf was a little bit complicated to swallow about the divorce and all those strange issues about do we take this woman, do we divorce the second wife? He has to give her a divorce conditional, and the first one needs a conditional divorce, and the whole thing was very strange. I wanted you to, first of all, to remember that this whole issue about the wife and the divorce is all theoretical because it's all according to Rabbi Yehuda, who says matkinim lo isha acheret, to which the Gemara starts to question him. How could you possibly do that? Then he's going to have 2 wives, or then he's going to, right, and raise all these questions on him. But it's all the answers we give are just answers. It's purely theoretical. We don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. We don't set an extra wife. We don't do that. So I think that even though it's hard to swallow, how could you possibly do this? We don't do it. So it makes us feel a little better. And in fact, Rashi even says in Daf Yud Gimel, he says, Kol sugya zot, I'm reading from the middle of Rashi, Dibur Matril Amenacha Tamuti, on the condition that you die. It's a very strange thing. He says, Kol sugya zot ein terutzim sheba yochalim la'amod. These answers are clearly not great answers, right? Until you get to the last one, which could. But he said, right, all those answers were very problematic. He says, Ki yesh lan tshuvot rabot. Tshuvot rabot doesn't mean answers, they are questions. And then he says, Ve'eino ela melamdim otanu, that im tomar kain yesh lashiv kain. And it's an intellectual exercise. Oh, if you say this, it doesn't make sense. Say this, it doesn't make sense until they finally get to the answer. But even the answer is all theoretical because we don't set aside an extra wife. So again, it's Rashi Dibur Matril Amenacha Tamuti it's like about the 4th line on Rashi on Yud Gimel, Amud Aleph. So it's a very interesting Rashi because he basically says, right, this is all a theoretical. I mean, in the end, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's not exactly theoretical. He says that we do get to an answer, but even all the suggestions they suggested was merely an intellectual exercise, like to show you that this is how Gemara works. You try to suggest this, and then you say that doesn't work, and then you think again, and it's more like an example of how to analyze something. But it wasn't really meant, and maybe because, maybe even in his day, people were bothered by this concept of you're just kind of throwing around the woman. It seems ridiculous. And maybe that's why he responds in that way. Also, he responding to the difficulty of the whole sugya, where how could it possibly make sense that a lot of the answers just didn't even make sense logically. So he's kind of addressing that. But that being said, again, it's hard to understand. One could say that the Kohen Gadol is just in a different place and his whole personal life is just different than everybody else's. And therefore, yes, we need a wife. And even if she's going to get divorced and then can't remarry him, well, that's just the way it is. And maybe he's just unique. And obviously it's only the Kohen Gadol, and it's maybe. But again, I prefer to view the sugya as it's really something that's more of an intellectual exercise and maybe even trying to show how ridiculous the suggestion of Rabbi Yehuda was. Remember, even the Chachamim thought his suggestion was ridiculous, and they said "Ein l'davar self," and clearly Amoraim did. And the fact that they ended up saying the only way you can make this case work is in this very unique, crazy case where you're going to give her these divorces, which is obviously unrealistic, was a way of kind of knocking out his shita. So those are possible ways of reading it. Okay, fine. I have some other things I read up about Sefer. I think I'll save them for another class because I want to get going with our sugya. So stay tuned tomorrow. We'll start off tomorrow's class with some other issues. So let's start now with the end of our daf, the end of Yud Gimel. We had a machloket between whether Tanakama says a Kohen can sacrifice when he's an onen. He works in the temple. He just doesn't eat the sacrificial meat. And that's because it's going to come up in Rashi, the last Rashi before the next Mishnah on today's daf, where it says Milo Mitrad. It's about 10 lines down. He says, Ubekodeshim be'inan simcha ugdula. Kodeshim need to be happy and it needs to be eaten. And he proceeds to quote this verse that we actually quoted when we were talking about the Korban Pesach. Lechan netatim limoshcha. The korbanot were given to you limoshcha with a chet, like for anointing purposes, which sounds like kings. Kederach shamalachim ochlim. They're supposed to be eaten like kings eat. And when kings eat a feast, they're happy and they're rejoicing. Now, if you're an onen, you can't rejoice. So that's why you can't eat the sacrificial meat, but you do still have to work if you're Kohen Gadol. Comes Rabbi Yehuda and he says, Kol hayom, to which we didn't know what we meant. We brought one suggestion, we rejected it. Rava now says, my Kol hayom, beginning of our daf, Lomar she'eno oved kol hayom gzera shema yochal. You don't eat all day because maybe you won't. Maybe you'll eat by accident. So we don't let you do the avoda so that you don't accidentally eat the meat. Since you can't eat the meat, and that's really what it means is on a deoraita level, on a Torah level, yes, you can eat, yes, you can do the avoda, and you should do the avoda. But the rabbi said, since you can't eat, I said before by accident, you can eat. I meant the opposite. You can work, you can't eat. Since you can't eat, we're not going to let you do the work because the work goes together, right? We're used to doing things together. If you do the work, then you eat. So we're worried he might accidentally eat, and that's going to create a problem. So Amalei Rav Ada bar Ava l'Rava, Umi gazar Rabbi Yehuda shema yochal. Rabbi Yehuda really said, we can't work, maybe you'll come to eat, and you can't work when you're in Onen. The Hatanan, doesn't it say in our Mishnah, this is going to contradict our Mishnah. And now we understand why they brought this sugya up here. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Af isha acheret matkinim lo, shema tamut ishto. So Rabbi Yehuda says, we put another wife in just in case his wife dies. Im maita ishto avid avoda. Right now, if his wife works, he's going to, the whole idea is maybe your wife will die. You'll have another wife in her place so that when you do the work, you have a wife. But what if she dies on Yom Kippur? You'll be in onin status. Seems like Rabbi Akiva thinks that that's fine because he says, in case your wife dies, right, you'll have another wife. He doesn't say in case your wife dies, you'll be in onin and you won't be able to work. He didn't say you can't work if your wife dies and we'll have to use another Kohen Gadol instead. He says, no, we need a different wife, not another Kohen Gadol. So Amalei, Hachi Hasha, they say, what are you comparing? They're apples and oranges. Why? Hatam kevan Yom Kippurim hu dekule amalo ka'achle unami lo atan lemecha. The whole reason a Kohen Gadol can't work when he's in Onen is maybe he'll eat the sacrificial meat. Now on Yom Kippur, there's no concern he's going to accidentally eat the sacrificial meat. So you end up with this fascinating halacha. Normally, the Kohen Gadol is Onen, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he can't do the work in the temple because maybe he'll eat. But when it comes to Yom Kippur, there's no concern he's going to eat because nobody's eating. So of course he's not going to accidentally eat on Yom Kippur. And therefore, he actually can and should do the avoda. Then we revert back to the doraita level that a Kohen's supposed to work, which makes a lot of sense. But hacha, in this case, of a regular day, to kule alma achle, everyone else is eating, hunami ata lemecha. Then we're concerned he might eat. And that's why on a regular day, we don't allow it. Now they ask, but wait a minute. Based on the previous sugya that we said was a complicated sugya, in the end, what do we say? That if his wife is to die in Yom Kippur, what will happen? Remember, he divorces the first wife on condition, saying, if I go into a shul, then you'll be divorced. So if he sees she's about to die, he goes into a shul. She turns out being divorced. She'll be divorced retroactively. He'll be married then. So retroactively, it will be that when Yom Kippur started, he was married to the other woman, which is exactly what we want, one wife only. So if that's the case, how would there be, he won't be an onen because retroactively, he won't actually be married to the wife, right? The first wife will not be his wife in the end because he'll go into the shul. He'll end up fulfilling the condition of her get. It'll turn out that her get retroactively was relevant before when he gave her the get originally, which means that technically speaking, he's not a status of onen because he's not actually married to her, right? Fascinating nafkamina of that whole thing. So they answer a great answer. This is like a real, right? Normally they're very halachic about things. Either he's an onen or he's not an onen. Comes and then they say, no. Nihida aninut lo chayil. And if you were concerned yesterday that the whole sugya dealt with these wives as if they're just kind of being thrown around and tossed around and treated that way, he says, no. Nihida aninut lo chayil itrude milo mitrad. It's true that technically speaking, she'll have been divorced and she won't actually be his wife. But you think he's not going to be terribly sad that his wife just died? You know, where's the personal aspect in this? Obviously, personally, he's going to feel very upset about his wife having died. In which case, he can't eat, he can't be involved in the sacrificial meat and also just the avoda because bekochim be'inan simcha gdula. They were given to you lemoshcha, and they have to be done with simcha, and therefore he can't. Therefore, there was the question. In other words, that what if she's an onen? In the end, they say it doesn't really matter because you can't eat the sacrificial meat, but you can explain why they asked the question in the first place about comparing onen. And here we learn that the status of onen isn't just a halachic status, but it also is a reflection of emotionally where you are, and that's significant. They take that into consideration, which is very interesting. We're going to move on to the next Mishnah now. And now I'll just mention one thing that I wanted to mention in the beginning of class because it's relevant to here, which is the Kohen Gadol. One second, I have to remember which one I wanted to mention here. Right. What Safrai claims in his book, okay, again, it's a historical, it's a reading of Mishnayot through a bit of a historical perspective. And what he says is that in the time, the way, I'll give you a few details now of what he said, which is, number one, we asked about the Yerusha. Didn't it go from father to son? So he says that actually, historically, it went from father to son, sometimes to brother if the son was too young when the father died, and until the Mered HaChashmonaim Mered, the Hanukkah story, they ended up taking over the Kuna Gdola, as if like they inherited it because of what they did. They kind of laid claim to the Kuna Gdola, but then it still went by inheritance from father to son until the time of Herod, 37 BCE. Herod comes in and he sees the Kuna Gdola as a big threat to him. This is right there, a power, right? There's always in the Gemara also, you see the Melech, the Kohen Gadol, they're always clumped together, the king and the Kohen Gadol, and he thought that they were a threat to his authority. So he decided to institute the Roman model of having this rotation that we saw before about the Paradrin, this rotation, so that nobody gets too much power. And therefore, he instituted this idea that we're going to switch it every year, and that it was no longer, or not necessarily anyway, by father to son. Okay, and he wanted to control the Kuna Gdola so that, right, and he actually uses the word to democratize, even though it obviously wasn't exactly a democracy, or maybe we all know that democracies can be, people can still buy their way into democracies, as we unfortunately know. Anyway, that's a whole aside. But the idea being that was all his way of basically saying, I don't want you to have too much power. And that's why they started switching every year. The other thing that he talks about, which is more relevant to this Mishnah, is that at a certain point in the last few generations, the Romans seized the clothing of the Kohen Gadol, and they only gave it back on Chagim. So besides the fact that we're going to see the Kohen Gadol doesn't have to work in the temple on a daily basis, but he actually couldn't at a certain point in history. He basically, because the Kohen Gadol can't work, we saw this before, without wearing the 8 clothes of the Kohen Gadol. He can't wear a Kohen Hedyot's clothes, except for Yom Kippur, obviously, when he's supposed to. So therefore, he didn't really work in the temple. So it says in the Mishnah, Kol Shiv'at HaYamim hu zorek et hadam, u'maktir et haktoret, u'mitiv et hanirot, u'makriv et harosh ve'et hareg. On the 7 days, which we're now going to learn, that he was separated. Now remember, why was he separated? Again, now I'll bring up as we're learning these things that I read over the weekend. We learned that he's separated, number 1, to stay away from his wife so he doesn't become a Bo'el Nidam, be Tameh 7 days. Number 2, he separates to get his mind into the mindset of Yom Kippur. Safrai adds a third answer, and he says it's also for big events, there's always prep before the event, something that you do to get everybody into the frame of mind of the event. So he says it was also, he calls it laha'adarat, laha'adir, to make it beautiful, right, to glorify. He gives an example, by the way, of one is Hava'at HaOmer, they have a whole ceremony bringing the Omer, and another interesting example he brings is B'dika Chametz. The B'dika Chametz is a way of kind of bringing in Pesach earlier with a big event, right? Pesach is almost here, right? When we have the night B'dika Chametz, we really feel like Pesach is here. It's a way of getting ready for the event. So the 7 days were part of getting him ready, and that's why this Mishnah is seen kind of in light of this. Both things that Safrai said, number 1, to make a big ceremony of it. So therefore he does all the work that week. And in addition, he didn't have a lot of experience. So he needed, on Yom Kippur, he's supposed to do all the avodot. We'll see which ones and all that, but he's supposed to do the avodot on Yom Kippur, all the regular daily things also. So he needs to have experience in it. He's not so experienced. So Kol Shivat Yamim, hu zorek et hadam. Okay, I'm just thinking, I like to bring real life examples. It popped into my head, this idea that when in Israel, when I got here and I have all my children in Israel, and in America, a doctor delivers generally. And in Israel, it's usually the midwives. And people are like, oh, you can go with a private doctor or not, and people said to me, in Israel, the midwives do way more births than the doctors do, and they're much more experienced because they do it all the time. So it's like the same thing here. You'd think the Kohen Gadol, he's the important guy, but the truth is he doesn't have a lot of experience on the ground. He was more of an administrator. He was more of a leader type figure, but he wasn't involved in the day-to-day. So those 7 days, you have to get him involved in the day-to-day. So what does he do? He sprinkles the blood of the Korban Tamir. He burns the incense, the Torah. He cleans out the candles. Every night they would light the candles, and in the morning they would clean them out. Some people say they also lit them in the morning. There's a bit of a debate, and it's interesting that lighting the candles isn't mentioned here because clearly he must have been the one to light the candles also. But that's a whole question about this Mishnah. Some people think it's included. Some people think it's not. And he takes the parts of the Korban Tamid that they would burn on the altar. He would take the head and the legs. Most people say it should be raglayim, not one leg. what about all the other parts of the Korban Tamid? So some people say they didn't bother him to do all that. It's a lot of schlepping, bringing all the stuff up the ramp, all the different parts. And they wanted him to do something symbolic, some aspect of it, but he didn't have to do everything. Some people say, no, the Rosh and the Regel are just indicative of everything. It just says it in the Mishnah, but it really meant all the parts. So he would do that. Ushar kol hayamim. Now, other than those 7 days, if he wanted to, he could sacrifice. He didn't have a turn in the temple like everyone else did. He wasn't part of a mishmar. He was always around. So if he wanted to, he could decide today I want to do something, again, assuming he had the clothes, which Safrai said, at a certain point in history he couldn't, but here we're talking when he could have. Kohen Gadol, how do we know this? Because Kohen Gadol makriv chelek barosh v'notel chelek barosh. He has first dibs. First dibs if he wants to do the avoda, first dibs if he wants to eat the food. He could come and say, you did the sacrifice, and normally if you do the sacrifice, you get the meat that goes to the Kohen. He could say, I'm getting it. Sounds a little bit like it could lead to misuse of his authority and kind of take meat from all these Kohanim. So I thought it was interesting to quote you the Tosefta in Yoma in chapter 1, Tosefta Halacha Hey. He quotes Rebbe here, who says, he can only take half. He can't take the whole portion of the Kohen. And they learn it from Hanoteret mina mincha la'Aharon u'lebanav. What's left over from the mincha goes to Aharon and his sons. What do you see from this pasuk? There's Aharon and his sons. He can only take half, right? He's kind of, weighed up against his sons, so they can get half and he can get half. So he can't take everything he wants, but he can take half a portion of the Kohanim if he wants. So now the Gemara is going to have two basic questions on this Mishnah. The first, and that's going to take us through today's stuff. The first issue is going to be, how could he do the avoda every day? Aren't we sprinkling para aduma waters on him? And we're going to see that, the question is not how can he do it? The question is, there's a machloket about, if you remember why we're sprinkling water on him, because maybe he became tamei lamet before he got to the temple. We want to make sure if he was impure to a dead person that we're taking care of that. So we sprinkle him every day in case which day, right? We had a whole thing, and then maybe not day number 4, but whatever. We sprinkle him every day, just in case. But now we're going to see that there's a machloket about what happens if you sprinkle someone who's actually not tamei lamet. If he's tamei lamet, great, it resolves it. If he's not impure, which is probably a high likelihood that he wasn't impure to a dead person, if he's not, then when you sprinkle him, he actually becomes impure. If he becomes impure, how can he do the avodah in the Beit HaMikdash? That's going to be the first issue. The second issue is going to be an inference from the Mishnah about the ketoret and the candles. If you notice the order, it says first he burns the ketoret, then he fixes the candles, the menorah. And we're going to question that because based on other sources, it seems like the order is reversed. Now, number one, who said the Mishnah is talking about a particular order? Could be, but it might not necessarily be. The Gemara is going to assume that they listed it in this order on purpose because they wanted to say Ketoret comes first, then lighting the candles. And then they're going to question that based on other sources of Mishnah Masechet Tamid. Then they're going to base it on a Mishnah Masechet Yoma. And they're going to say there seem to be contradictions here because those seem to say first you do the candles, then you do the Ketoret. So those are our two issues for the rest of today's talk. So now we're going to start. Man Tana. So who's the Tana of this Mishnah? Comes Rav Chisda, Delo ke Rabbi Akiva. Not like Rabbi Akiva, De'i Rabbi Akiva ha'amar, because Rabbi Akiva is the one who has that approach that I told you before. Tahor shenafla alav haza'ah timato. If you have a pure person who gets sprinkled with the para aduma waters, the mechatat, which is also called in the Torah mei midah, then you become impure, in which case the Kohen, all those 7 days is going to be impure. Now, what kind of impurity? It's the kind of impurity that you have to go to the mikveh that day. You wait till the sun sets, and then you'll be pure the next morning. So every morning he'll be pure, but then they're going to sprinkle the blood on him. He'll become impure. So how can he do the work of that day? So the first, we're going to have two approaches to how to explain it. The first is going to say clearly our Mishnah doesn't hold like Rabbi Akiva. Then we're going to bring an answer how you can actually work our Mishnah out with Rabbi Akiva. But it will take a while before we get there because throughout this, we're going to try to figure out what's this machlokah Rabbi Akiva and the rabbis, how does each one explain their opinion, etc. So now they're going to say it's delo ke Rabbi Akiva. De'i Rabbi Akiva ha'amal. Okay, you can also follow in the sheet today. It also has all this kind of mapped out. Rabbi Akiva said, Tahor shenafla alav haza'ah tima'ato. So he says, you're going to be impure, which means the Kohen's going to be impure, which means he can't do all this work all that week. Hechi avad avoda. So how can he possibly do the avodah? Now, how do we know that there's a machloket about this? Titania, as it says in the following bright. We're going to quote the verse from Parshat Chukat, where it talks about the paraduma, chapter 19 of Bamidbar. V'hiza hatahor ala tameh. It says, and the pure person sprinkles the blood on the impure person, right? The pure person is the one handling the waters. He has to be pure because otherwise he'll make the waters impure. He now sprinkles the blood on the impure person. So what is he darshan from here? Al hatameh tahor, va'al tahor tameh divrei Rabbi Akiva. He says, if it says viza tahor ala tameh, that means if he sprinkles a tameh person, the tameh person will become pure. But if he sprinkles a pure person, that pure person will become impure. We still don't exactly know how he gets it, but we see from the words tahor, it's ala tameh, seems to indicate that, but we'll get to it soon a little more in depth. Chachamim omrim, ein advarim halalu amurim, ela, and those words don't mean what you think they mean. They're meant to teach you some other halacha. Bidvarim hamekablim tuma, about items that accept impurity. We don't yet know what this means, neither does the Gemara. The Gemara asks, Mahi, what is this? The Gemara asks, Keditznan, as it says in the following Mishnah Masechet Para, about the paraduma. Nitkaven lahazot ala beima, v'hiza al ha'adam. If you intended, okay, one thing you have to know here is an animal does not become impure. We've talked about this before in its lifetime. A person can become impure by a sheretz, a creepy crawly creature, or all sorts of ways, right? All different things, a dead person, all sorts of ways that can become tameh. An animal, until the animal dies and then it becomes food, then it can be makabel tumah, the food. But a live animal can't be makabel tumah. So if you intend to sprinkle the paraduma waters, by mistake, really, because you can't do this on an animal, but when you went to sprinkle them, what did you do? You accidentally sprinkled on a person. I'm going to remind you what we do. We take this azov, right, a hyssop branch, and we dip it in the water, and then we sprinkle it on the person. So if you intended to sprinkle on an animal, by accident, you sprinkled it on a person. Im yesh be'ezov yishne. Okay, you need to know one other halacha, which is the paraduma waters can't be used, also the animal can't be used for work. If you remember, the paraduma can't be an animal that you worked at all. Neither can the water. You can't use it for anything else other than sprinkling on a person. So if you sprinkle it on an animal, which you're not supposed to sprinkle it on, it's as if you did what we call avodah, which means that the water is disqualified. But if you intended to sprinkle on an animal, but instead by accident you sprinkled on a person, so first of all, it won't work to help that person because that person you need to do it with intention. But it didn't disqualify the waters because it's not considered avodah by sprinkling on a person. That's what you normally do with it. So that's fine. So then, im yesh be'ezov, once you dipped it, you sprinkle on someone. Now, usually you still have water in that branch. So if you now realize that you made a mistake and now someone else is near you and they need sprinkling, you can sprinkle it on them, okay? Or let's say the person who you sprinkled it on accidentally was someone who needed purification. So you can just continue now and do it with intention and sprinkle on it. But nitkaven lahazot ala adam, if you intended to sprinkle on a person, v'hiza ala beima, let's say the person moved and there was an animal there, right? You're about to sprinkle on him and he moves out of the way for whatever reason. And, maybe a bird comes flying at him and he walks off and you end up sprinkling on the bird or on an animal or something that was standing behind him. Im yesh be'ezov lo yishne. If you still have water left on the hyssop branch, you can't just continue and sprinkle it on the person. You end up having to dip it again and redo it because you've disqualified those waters. That's what he says, the words, v'hiza hatahor ala tameh. It has to be on the tameh. If it's on something that can't be, it has to be on something that is potentially able to be purified. If it's on an animal that's not potential, that doesn't even accept impurity, can't become impure, then it disqualifies the water. That's the way Chachamim read that pasuk. So now we want to understand my time with the Rabbi Akiva. Where does he get it from? Nichtav Rachmana v'hiza tahor alav. It could have just simply said in the pasuk, and the tahor person, the pure person, sprinkles on him. We obviously know who him is. Him is the person who became impure. My ala tameh. Why does it say al hatameh specifically? It's to teach you shma mina only on the tameh, ala tameh tahor. But if you do it ala tahor, if you're going to do it on the tahor, he's going to become tameh. Even though it's a little bit not logical, and we'll see what he says about this in a minute. For Rabbanan, what did Rabbanan do with that verse? As we said, it comes to teach you, has to be done on items that could become impure. And if they can't, they could become impure potentially. If they're things like an animal that can't become impure, then the water's disqualified. And then you have to dip it again. But the whole thing that Rabbi Yehuda said, I disagree with him entirely because it's totally illogical. If these waters have the power to take someone who's impure and turn him into pure, won't it all the more so purify a pure person? Obviously, a pure person doesn't need purification, but it's certainly not going to make him worse than he is, right? It would be ridiculous. It's totally counterintuitive what Rabbi Akiva says. So how does Rabbi Akiva explain this? Well, he has some proof in the text. We'll start with this, though. Rabbi Akiva, Hainu de Ka'amar Shlomo. This is what Shlomo HaMelech said in Sefer Kohelet. When he talked about, he said, Amarti ech kama, said I would become very smart. V'yiru chokami meni. And even though I'm very smart, there's things that I don't understand. And that's this, right? This makes absolutely no sense, right? In general, there's things about the paradigm that don't make sense. And we're going to see another one that's very similar to this, which is much more clear in the text. So he says, this is one of those things that just don't make sense to me. Sometimes we don't understand what it says in the Torah. The Rabbanan, what does he do with that verse? Because everybody knows there's strange things about paraduma that we don't understand. So according to Rabbi Akiva, it includes this halacha, that if you sprinkle the paraduma waters on someone who's pure, he becomes impure. So comes the rabbis and he said, no. If you sprinkle it on a pure person. It creates impurity on other pure people involved, but where? We're going to see it in a verse right now. The one who sprinkles and someone who is sprinkled on, if they're pure, nothing happens to them. The halacha that Shlomo HaMelech was referring to in that pasuk is hanogea behem tameh, someone who touches the paraduma waters. If you're pure and you touch the paraduma waters, you become impure. That's what Shlomo HaMelech was saying. I never really figured out. I can't understand how that works. So now they say, wait a minute. Rabbis, you think the one who sprinkles the water is tahor, as long as assuming he doesn't touch the waters, right? Which he doesn't have to because he dips it in the water and then he sprinkles it. He doesn't actually physically touch them. But mazeh tahor, you think he's tahor? It says explicitly in the verse that he's not. Now we're going to read the verse. V'haktiv. Okay, I'll read you the whole verse. It's on the sheet also, and it's in the Torah. Or Bamidbar Yutet. No, not this one. Sorry, my mistake. Bamidbar Yutet Kaf Aleph. This will be forever a rule. The one who sprinkles the paraduma waters will have to wash his clothes. That means you're impure for the day and your clothes become impure. Now, what does it say there? If you sprinkle them, not if you touch them. And that goes against what the rabbi said. They go against an explicit pasuk. And someone who touches the nida waters is tamei erev. So we're going to have a few questions against him from this pasuk. Number one, so what does he answer? That's not mazeh. Even though it says one who sprinkles, it doesn't really mean sprinkles. My mazeh nogeh means one who touches. That's a really not good answer because v'haktiv mazeh, v'haktiv nogeh. Number one, the verse mentions two different people, the sprinkler and the one who touches. So you can't say the sprinkler means the one who touches when the second part was talking about that. And even if you might say maybe it's referring to the same person, it can't possibly be because the laws are different for each one. One needs his clothes washed and the other is just tamei. And one has tuma plus the clothes become tamei, and one is just the person becomes tamei, not his clothes. So there's clearly a different law for the one who is called the mazeh and the one who's nogeh. So you can't say the mazeh is the nogeh as the one who touched the waters. That's not possible. So answer number two. Answer number one didn't work. Ela, my mazeh, no say. Mazeh means the one who carries. If you carry, let's say the bowl that has the paraduma waters in it, even if you don't touch the waters, you carried it, you're tamei. And that's what mazeh means. Not that you actually sprinkled, even though it says you sprinkled, and we're going to have to explain then why does it say sprinkled if that's not really what it meant. We'll get to that in a minute. So, Ella, so why did the Torah say the one who carries? It says that another psukim of impurity. My tamaktiv mazeh. Well, it's to teach you something else. Hakamash malan, it comes to teach you debi'ina shiur haza'ah. In order to become impure by carrying these waters, has to be that they had a requisite amount of sprinkling waters. Now, is there a requisite amount of sprinkling waters? Well, there's a debate about it. So they're going to say, how much do you need to sprinkle on a person? There's a machloket. In order to purify someone, do you need a certain amount? Or can you just sprinkle a drop? And is that enough? So there's a machloket. So if you say, there's a certain requisite amount, then you can say the person who carries it only becomes impure if they carry the requisite amount. But but if you hold there's no requisite amount for that, then you can't say this is coming for a requisite amount. To which the Gemara answers, no, you could. When we say it doesn't have a requisite amount, that means how much needs to be sprinkled on a person doesn't have a requisite amount. But but in the kli, it needs a certain amount. It says in the following Mishnah, how much you need to be in the bowl in order to be able to use it to sprinkle the waters. Since you're dipping this hyssop branch inside, it's true that all you need to sprinkle on a person, at least according to one opinion, is just a drop. But in order to dip it in, it has to have enough liquid in order to make the dipping meaningful, right? If you have a drop in there and you put your branch into a drop of water, it's going to barely have anything on it, right? You need more in order to dip and then have something on your branch. So therefore, when it says the one who carries, the reason why they called him mazeh was to teach you he's only going to become impure if it has enough in the bowl that could have been used for sprinkling on someone. So we've resolved that. So again, that was all to discuss Rabbi Akiva and the rabbi's opinion and how they each read this verse, right? According to the Chachamim, right, the mazeh isn't literally the mazeh. According to Rabbi Akiva, the mazeh is the mazeh. The mazeh, and in addition, anyone who's pure and gets sprinkled on, they're all going to become impure from the process. And that's part of this paradoxical nature of the paraduma, that it creates purity for someone who's impure, but people who are pure, who deal with it, who get sprinkled by it, in some way, even though they're tahor, would become impure, which then leads us to say our Mishnah can't be Rabbi Akiva, because according to this, the Kohen Gadol gets sprinkled every day, and yet he's doing avoda. That can't possibly be. To which Abaye says, what do you mean? Afilu tema Rabbi Akiva. I'll explain the Mishnah according to Rabbi Akiva. There's a great way to do it. Here's a good creative solution. Da'avid avoda kule yoma. What happens in the beginning of every day? He wakes up, he does all the avodot, comes close to the end of the day, lepanya, as it gets close to evening, right? Lifnot erev, as they say in Hebrew, panya. Madu alav, madu is mazu, dalad and zayin switch in Aramaic. Vitavil. So you sprinkle him toward the end of the day, once he's finished with all his avodot. So you sprinkle the paraduma waters. Now he happens to become tameh. So what does he do? He goes to the mikveh, right? You leave enough time, he could still go to the mikveh during the day. And then you go to, right, Avid Harev Shemesh, he waits for the sun to set fully, right? Seder Kochavim, the 3 stars come out. He's pure. And now the next day he wakes up, he's pure, everything's fine. He does all the avoda. They sprinkle him toward the end of the day. And that's how you can reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Akiva. New section. Now we're going to deal with the other part of the Mishnah. As I said, the order of the Ktoret and the candles. Here we're going to learn this sugya. I'll just point out that this sugya appears later on in Yoma, because we're going to quote a Mishnah in Yoma, and we're going to deal with it, parts of it, much more in depth when we get there. In Yoma, right, I think it's Lamed Gimel, Amud, just check. Lamed Gimel, yeah. Okay, in Daf Lamed Gimel, we're going to see this more in depth, so we'll deal with some of the aspects of it. Some of them we'll wait to when we get to there. Maktirat Aktoret u'meitivet hanerot. So what do you see here? Seems like first you do the Ktoret, then you do the candles. Uriminu, but this contradicts another source. It says in Masechet Tamid. Masechet Tamid is a Masechet we'll get to toward the end of the cycle, where it discusses how they did the Kimashma'o, right? The Korban Tamid, how they did it on a daily basis, what went on in the temple in general, in the Avodah on a daily basis. Right here, we're really getting Yom Kippur, but through Yom Kippur, we're going to learn some other things. So it seems that, right, our Mishnah says Ktoret and Nerot, Uriminu, but it says in Masechet Tamid, Misha Zacha, we're talking about the pious. They did these lotteries for the Kohanim who got to do the work. Misha Zacha b'dishon mizbeach hapnimi, u'misha Zacha b'menorah, u'misha Zacha b'ktoret. So it says the one who got to do the cleaning up of the mizbeach, the inner mizbeach, then the one who got to do the menorah, and then the one who got to do the ktoret. So what do you see here? The menorah comes before the incense in that Mishnah, whereas here the incense came before the menorah. So Amar Rav Huna, Mantana Tamid, Rabbi Shimon Isha Mitzpahu. There were different traditions about how things happened in the temple. We've already seen this. We saw it with Hillel, right, in Pesach. About did they eat the matzah and the maror and the Pesach all together? Did they not? There was this bit of a debate about what actually happened. And there were certain people who were known that they knew because they lived in that generation they were also alive before the destruction and they were alive after the destruction, and they were telling us all sorts of traditions, what went on. One of those people is Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah. So he says, I have this tradition that now the way Mishnayot worked was that they were collections of Mishnayot, either orally, right? They were passed down orally, and then kind of they got written by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi or his people, and they put it together in word, they wrote it down. But there's this assumption here, certainly this sugya talks about it, that Mishnah, he took a section of Mishnayot that were all from the school of Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah. And in Yoma, it was the rabbis who disagree with him. So there seems to be a disagreement, which came first in the temple, and the tradition you see in Tamir is him, and the one you see here is the rabbis. But there's a bit of a problem with that. But it seems to be the opposite in Masechet Tamid, because it seems it's not Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah. Titnan, and here we're talking about a different issue, which is when you put the blood of the Korban Tamid on the corners of the altar. We'll see when we get to Zvachim, there's all different ways you do it. There's something called Shtayin Shem Arba, which is you put it in you do two placings of the blood on the corners, which ends up like 4. And that's what we're going to see right now. How does that work? You come to the Kerem Mizrachit Tzfoni, you go to the northeast corner of the altar first. Notem Mizrachat Tzafona. You do one nitina, one putting of blood, but you put it right on the corner, so it gets on both sides at once. Then you go Ma'aravit Romit, you go to the southwest corner now, the opposite one. Notem, you don't walk across on a diagonal, you walk around, you always walk to your right on the altar. And we'll get to that also at some point, but now we're going to see you get to the other corner, Notem Ma'arav Daroma. So again, you do one placing of the blood, which ends up on both sides. Okay, that's the Mishnah. The Tane Alan is a bright on that Mishnah that says, Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah mishaneh b'tamid. He has a different way of doing it. Mizrachi tzfoni notei mizrachat tzafona. The first one he does the same way they said, but when you get to Ma'aravit Romit, the southwestern corner, notei ma'arava. First you do one placing on the west, v'achar kach notei daroma. So you end up with 3 placings, which end up on 4 corners. So he has a different approach on the Mishnah and Tamid. So how could you possibly say the Mishnayot and Tamid were all according to Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah? So Elam Rabbi Yochanan, Mantana Seder Yoma, Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah. So he basically flips it. He says, okay, Rav Huna, you suggested that's Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah. I'll just say that in Yoma it's Rabbi Shimon Ish HaMitzpah, and with that we resolve it. But we're going to have another question, as I said. Rami Seder Yoma, Seder Yoma. But the order in Yoma itself seems to contradict. So if you're going to assume each Masechet is a different tradition, we're going to have a problem with ours. Why? Ditnan, as it says in the Mishnah. Payis hasheni, mi shochet, mi zorek, mi medashen, mizbeach hapnimi, umi medashen et hamenorah. Right. So the second lottery that they did was who slaughters, who sprinkles the blood of the Korban Tamid, who's going to sweep the inner altar, who's going to sweep the menorah, clean it out. Umi ma'aleh varim lakevesh. Now notice what's missing: the incense. Payis hashlishi. When you get to the third, what happens? Chadashim laktoret bo v'afi. So you say, okay, who hasn't gone yet, come be part of the lottery for the ktoret. So you see clearly that the menorah came first and then the ktoret. So that contradicts our Mishnah, which said ktoret then menorah. So Amar Abai lo kashya. Kam batavat shtei nerot, kam batavat chamesh nerot. Now they say, well, this is something we're going to learn much more in depth there, which is they split the cleaning of the candles. First they did 5, then they did 2. Why they split it that way, we'll see later. And they did something in between. What did they do in between? The assumption is, right, the one that says Nerot, then Ktoret was talking about the first 5 candles. And then they did the Ktoret in the middle. And then the one that says the Ktoret came first was talking about before the last 2 candles. So the Ktoret, it depends your perspective, which candles you're looking at. That's how Abaye answers it. To which they question Abaye and they say, wait a minute. L'meimer de Ktoret mafsiklu. You want to say that the Ktoret was what? Now there's a debate we're going to see in Lamed Gimel what they did in between the 5 and the 2. Everyone agrees there was 5 and 2, and they were split, and there was something in the middle. One says it was the Ktoret, one says it was the blood, the sprinkling of the blood of the Korban Tamid happened in between the Hatavat 5 Nerot and 2 Nerot. So they say, are you going to say the Ktoret mafsiklu? It was the Ktoret that was in the middle, because that was your answer, Abaye. Abaye misader ma'aracha mishmei de Gemara. Abaye explained, according to the Gemara, according to his tradition, that he got what the order was. According to what he said, it was the blood of the Korban Tamid. I want to point out that in your siddur you can find this. In the Korbanot section, there's a section in between Berchot HaShachar and Baruch Shamar, where we say what all sorts of things about the Korbanot. And in there is exactly this line, and it comes from Yoma Lamed Gimel. And it basically says he taught that this is the order they did it. And the Dama Tamir comes in the middle and not the Torah. So that seems to contradict Abaye's answer. So Amrei lo kasha hila Abba Shaul hala Rabbanan. Abba Shaul, by the way, is another person who gave a lot of traditions. In fact, we're starting in Hadran a new thing today. You can look at Facebook. It's going to be a whole post on Abba Shaul. We're going to do characters, places, and words in the Gemara. So you can start following on our Facebook page if you're not yet following. So he was one of the people that also was known to testify about things that happened in the temple. So there's two traditions. What Abaye said there, and if you look at it in the Siddur, you'll see it's a quote from Yoma Lamed Gimel. It says that's in the name of Abba Shaul. But when he answers the question on our sugya, he was talking according to the rabbis who disagree. Tanya, and here's the machloka between them. Lo yetiv v'tanirot v'achar kach yaktir, ela yaktir v'achar kach yetiv. Don't clean the candles and then do the Torah. You should first do the Torah and then do the candles. Abba Shaul omer metiv v'achar kach maktir. First you fix all the candles and then you do the Torah, meaning the Dama Tamir is what comes in between the candles and the Torah comes at the very end. So now they're going to say, my time to Abba Shaul, what's his reason? And we'll start tomorrow with Rabbanan's reason. We'll just finish up with Abba Shaul's reason. Dichtiv, as it says in the pasuk, baboker betivo tanerot yaktirena. So here they say, right? What does it say? What's the order of the verse? In the morning, every morning, he would be metiva tanerot, and then it says yaktirena. After he did the candles, then he burnt the incense, and that's where Abba Shaul gets his tradition, which is not what Abaye went by when he resolved this contradiction. That it was first all the candles, then they did the Torah. Abaye, who suggested here that the Torah was done in the middle, which really means, since you still had two candles to go, it really means the incense was done before the candles, and that matches our Mishnah, who says Torah, then they wrote. That's according to the rabbi's tradition. But the rabbi said that was the order, and we're going to have to see what they do with the verse, because the verse does seem to indicate candles, then Torah, and not Torah and candles. So you'll have to wait for tomorrow for that. Have a great day, everyone. If you want, as I said in the beginning of Shiur, as we're part of Women's International Talmud Day, there's a link on our site. I'll also send it out with the daf post today. If you want to find other shiurim that are going on in this context, all sorts of shiurim, a bunch of them are focused on Yoma specifically. You can go and listen to the shiurim. There's some in Hebrew, there's some in English. So it's a day full of Talmud shiurim. Have a great day, everyone. Shavua tov.